I'm Eva, and for 18 years I respected my husband's one rule: never open the basement door. When Steve Katz died last month, I finally broke it down with a crowbar, expecting to find his dirty secrets. What I discovered instead made me realize I never knew the man I was married to at all. And honestly, I wish he was still alive so I could tell him I'm sorry for everything I thought about him in those final moments. My name is Ava, and I've been living a lie for nearly 2 decades. Not the kind of lie where I was deceiving anyone else, but the kind where I was deceiving myself about the person I shared my bed with, raised a child with, and built what I thought was a transparent life with in Columbus, Ohio. Steve Katz was my husband for 18 years. To everyone who knew us, we were the picture of suburban stability. He worked as an insurance adjuster, the kind of job that requires attention to detail and a methodical approach to life. I teach high school art, which means I spend my days trying to coax creativity out of teenagers who would rather be anywhere else. We have a 16-year-old daughter named Brielle, who's smart, sarcastic, and currently drowning in college applications while dealing with the fresh grief of losing her father. On the surface, Steve was exactly what he appeared to be: reliable, predictable, maybe even a little boring by some people's standards. He was the type of man who color-coordinated his tools, never missed a mortgage payment, and could fold a fitted sheet so perfectly it looked like it belonged in a display case. He drove the same Honda Civic for 12 years, not because we couldn't afford a new car, but because he saw no point in replacing something that still ran perfectly well. But here's the thing about living with someone for nearly 2 decades. You start to notice the little inconsistencies, the small moments that don't quite add up. For me, those moments all centered around one locked door in our basement. Steve claimed it was his workshop space, his man cave where he could spread out his woodworking projects and keep his important paperwork organized without my artistic chaos interfering with his system. He'd chuckle when he said it, wrapping his arm around my waist in that way that was supposed to make me feel included in the joke rather than excluded from the space. "Trust me, Eva," he'd say whenever I'd tease him about the mysterious locked room. "There's nothing interesting down there, just sawdust, old tax returns, and half-finished birdhouses that will probably never see the light of day." I respected that boundary because that's what you do in a marriage, right? You give each other space to be individuals, to have something that's entirely your own. Brielle used to joke that Dad was probably hiding his secret comic book collection, or maybe a shrine to his favorite baseball team. We'd laugh about it over dinner, and Steve would just smile that quiet smile of his and change the subject. But the jokes couldn't quite mask the persistent ache I felt about being shut out of an entire part of our home. It wasn't that I needed to control every inch of our house. I had my own art studio space in the converted garage that Steve rarely entered. It was more about the absolute nature of the boundary, the way his jaw would tighten just slightly if I even joked about getting a peek inside, the way he'd quickly pocket the key if he thought I was paying too much attention to it. Over the years, that locked door became a symbol of something larger in our marriage. Not secrets, exactly, but a kind of parallel life that Steve maintained alongside our shared one. I started to wonder what else he might be keeping separate from me. Were there thoughts he didn't share? Dreams he was pursuing without me? Financial decisions I wasn't part of? The wondering became worse after arguments. During the quiet, tense hours that followed any disagreement, I'd find myself staring at that basement door and imagining what Steve might be doing down there. Was he avoiding me? Was he on the phone with someone else? Was there another version of my husband that existed in that locked space? One that might be more honest or more troubled than the man I knew upstairs? Last month, all of that wondering became irrelevant when Steve collapsed at his office from a massive heart attack. 45 years old, No warning signs, no history of heart problems in his family. One minute he was reviewing claim files, and the next minute his coworkers were calling 911. He died before the ambulance reached the hospital. The grief hit me like a freight train, but so did something else I wasn't prepared for. A sudden, overwhelming need to understand who I'd really been married to. When someone dies unexpectedly, you're left with so many unfinished conversations, so many questions you never thought to ask because you assumed you'd have decades more to figure it all out. That locked door, which had once been just a minor curiosity, suddenly loomed enormous in my mind. It represented everything I didn't know about Steve, everything I'd never asked, every boundary I'd respected that might have been hiding something crucial about the man I'd built my life around. For the first few weeks after the funeral, I was too consumed with the practical aspects of grief to think about the basement. There were insurance claims to file, ironic, considering Steve's profession, and probate proceedings to navigate. Brielle needed help processing her loss while simultaneously trying to finish her senior year and complete college applications. The house felt too quiet, too empty, and too full of memories all at the same time. But as the initial shock began to wear off, that locked door started calling to me in a way it never had before. I'd walk past it on my way to do laundry and feel my heart rate spike. I'd lie awake at night wondering what secret Steve had taken with him to the grave. I'd catch myself standing in front of the door, touching the lock, imagining all the conversations we'd never have about whatever was behind it. The worst part was the guilt. Here I was, barely a month after burying my husband, and instead of just missing him, I was suspicious of him. Instead of cherishing the memories we'd made, I was obsessing over the parts of his life he'd kept hidden from me. What kind of wife does that make me? What kind of person becomes paranoid about their dead spouse's privacy? But I couldn't stop myself from wondering. And deep down, underneath all the grief and guilt, there was another feeling growing stronger every day. The absolute certainty that I needed to know what was behind that door, no matter what it cost me. Because here's the thing about secrets in a marriage. They don't die with the person who kept them. They live on, growing larger and more ominous in the silence they leave behind. And I was about to discover that sometimes the thing you're most afraid to find is also the thing that will change everything you thought you knew about love, sacrifice, and the person you chose to spend your life with. I just didn't know yet whether that change would destroy me or save me. Let me paint you a picture of what my marriage to Steve Katz looked like from the outside, because I think it's important you understand just how normal, how perfectly ordinary our life seemed before everything I thought I knew got turned upside down. We lived in a modest split-level house on Maple Street in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of neighborhood where people still wave to each other from their driveways and kids ride their bikes in the street until the streetlights come on. Our house was built in 1987 with cream-colored siding and forest green shutters that Steve repainted every 3 years like clockwork. He kept a detailed home maintenance spreadsheet, because of course he did, with color-coded cells indicating when each task was due. Steve was methodical about everything. His sock drawer was organized by color and season. His tools hung on pegboard in the garage with painted outlines so he'd know exactly where each one belonged. He changed the batteries in our smoke detectors every daylight saving time, whether they needed it or not. He was the kind of man who read instruction manuals cover to cover before assembling anything, who kept every receipt organized in labeled folders, and who never ever forgot to pay a bill on time. I used to tease him about being so rigid, calling him my beautiful robot, when he'd spend Saturday mornings following his cleaning schedule to the minute. But the truth was, I found his predictability comforting after growing up in a house where my father's mood swings could derail any family plan without warning. Steve's steadiness felt like safety to me. Our daily routine was as reliable as his maintenance schedule. Steve left for work at 7:23 every morning, kissed me goodbye at the kitchen counter, and told me to have a good day. He worked for Midwest Insurance Group, where he'd been employed for 12 years, handling property damage claims with the same attention to detail he brought to everything else in his life. His colleagues respected him, his supervisors trusted him, and his clients appreciated his thoroughness. He wasn't flashy or ambitious, but he was competent and reliable, qualities that seemed increasingly rare in the world. I taught art at Roosevelt High School, which meant my days were filled with teenage drama, paint-stained smocks, and the eternal challenge of convincing 16-year-olds that creativity mattered in a world obsessed with standardized test scores. I loved my job, loved watching students discover they could make something beautiful with their hands, loved the controlled chaos of a classroom full of young artists figuring out how to express themselves. Steve and I would meet back at home around 5:30 most evenings. He'd change out of his work clothes, always khakis and a button-down shirt in white, light blue, or pale yellow, and into what he called his home uniform of jeans and a plain t-shirt. I'd usually be covered in paint or clay, depending on what projects my students had been working on that day. Dinner was a family affair when Brielle was younger, but as she hit her teenage years and became busier with school activities, it became more often just Steve and me, sitting at our kitchen table, sharing the details of our days. Steve would tell me about particularly challenging claims he was investigating, and I'd share stories about my students' latest artistic breakthroughs or disasters. After dinner, Steve would help with dishes. He was a firm believer that the person who didn't cook shouldn't have to clean up alone, and then we'd usually settle into our evening routine. I'd grade papers or work on my own art projects in the living room while Steve would disappear into his home office to handle what he called administrative tasks, paying bills, organizing paperwork, updating his various spreadsheets and maintenance schedules. This is where our perfectly normal life had its one persistent abnormality. Around 8:30 or 9 o'clock most evenings, Steve would announce he was going down to his workshop for an hour or two. He'd grab a bottle of water and head for the basement door, pulling out a key that he kept on a separate ring from his regular house keys. I'd hear the lock click, then his footsteps on the wooden stairs, and then nothing. Our basement wasn't soundproofed, and the rest of the house was quiet in the evenings. I should have been able to hear sawing, hammering, the sounds of whatever woodworking projects he claimed to be working on down there. But mostly what I heard was silence. Occasionally, I'd catch the faint sound of movement, footsteps, maybe the scraping of a chair, but never the sounds of actual construction. When I'd tease him about his mysteriously quiet workshop, Steve would just laugh and say he spent most of his time down there planning projects, organizing materials, or catching up on paperwork related to his hobby. "I'm not actually building anything exciting," he'd tell me. "Mostly just measuring twice and cutting once, if you know what I mean." The basement workshop had been Steve's domain since we moved into the house 18 years ago. On our first walkthrough with the realtor, he'd immediately pointed to the finished basement and declared it perfect for his woodworking hobby. I was focused on the kitchen and the natural light in what would become my art studio space, so I was happy to let him claim the basement as his territory. The only thing that seemed odd was how quickly he'd installed that lock. We moved in on a Saturday, and by Sunday evening there was a deadbolt on the basement door. When I asked about it, Steve explained that he wanted to keep his tools secure, especially once we had Brielle toddling around the house. "Power tools and curious toddlers don't mix," he said, which made perfect sense at the time, but Brielle was 16 now, and the lock remained. More than that, it had become an absolute boundary in our house. Steve never forgot to lock it when he came upstairs. He never left the key lying around. He never invited Brielle or me to see what he was working on. When Brielle was younger and would ask to help with his projects, he'd always redirect her to activities we could do together upstairs. "Dad's workshop is boring," he'd tell her. "Let's build something fun up here instead." And then he'd help her construct elaborate blanket forts, or teach her to make simple crafts at the kitchen table. He was never mean about excluding us from the basement. He just made it clear that it was his space alone, and he offered alternatives that seemed more appealing anyway. Over the years, I'd occasionally make jokes about the locked room. "What are you really doing down there, Steve? Building a secret bunker? Hiding a second family?" I'd laugh when I said it, and he'd laugh too, but his laughter always seemed just a little forced, a little too quick. "You know me, Eva," he'd say, pulling me into a hug. "I'm the most boring man alive. If I was going to have a secret, it would probably be something incredibly mundane, like a collection of vintage insurance manuals or a detailed spreadsheet tracking the weather patterns in Ohio." The thing was, I did know him, or I thought I did. Steve wasn't the type of man who seemed capable of elaborate deceptions. He couldn't even successfully plan surprise birthday parties because he was terrible at keeping secrets from me. He'd get this guilty expression whenever he was trying to hide something pleasant, like anniversary gifts or vacation plans. His face was an open book in almost every other area of our life together. So why was the basement different? Why was that the one area where his usual transparency seemed to evaporate? I told myself it was just his need for personal space, his one area of independence in a marriage where we shared almost everything else. I respected it the way I respected his preference for action movies over romantic comedies, or his need to wake up 15 minutes before his alarm and lie quietly in bed organizing his thoughts for the day. But if I'm being completely honest, there was always a small part of me that wondered. Not about anything dramatic or devastating. I never seriously thought Steve was having an affair or hiding massive debts or living some kind of double life. But I did wonder what he did during those quiet hours in the basement. I wondered why his woodworking hobby never seemed to produce any finished projects. I wondered why he never seemed excited to share his progress with me the way he shared everything else. Those small wonderings never felt big enough to challenge or confront. They were just tiny gaps in my understanding of my husband, little mysteries that seemed harmless enough to live with. After all, everyone deserves some privacy, some space that's entirely their own. I had no idea that those tiny gaps were actually enormous chasms, and that the mystery I'd been living with for 18 years was about to reveal something that would completely rewrite my understanding of the man I'd married, the life we'd built together, and the true meaning of love and sacrifice. But all of that was still hidden behind a locked door, waiting for the moment when grief and curiosity would finally overcome respect and trust. 3 weeks after Steve's funeral, I found myself sitting at our kitchen table at 2 a.m, surrounded by stacks of paperwork that seemed to multiply every time I looked away. Death, I discovered, generates an overwhelming amount of bureaucracy. Insurance forms, probate documents, bank statements, tax records. It's like the entire financial system demands proof that someone actually existed before it will acknowledge that they're gone. I'd been putting off the thorough investigation of Steve's affairs because, frankly, I wasn't ready to face the finality of it all. Going through someone's financial records feels invasive, even when that someone was your husband and you're legally entitled to access everything. But the probate attorney had been clear. I needed to locate all assets, debts, and accounts before we could move forward with settling the estate. That's when I first saw the payments to Sunshine Storage Solutions. I was going through Steve's checking account statements, cross-referencing them with bills I knew we had, mortgage, utilities, car payment, Brielle's school expenses, when I noticed a monthly automatic payment that didn't match anything familiar. $800 every month going to a company I'd never heard of. At first, I thought it might be some kind of insurance payment that Steve handled separately from our regular bills. He was methodical about our finances, but he also believed in keeping certain business expenses separate from household accounts. Maybe this was related to his work, or a professional development course, or equipment rental for his woodworking hobby. But $800 a month? That seemed excessive for any of those explanations. I started going backward through the statements month by month, looking for when these payments had started. What I found made my hands shake. The payments to Sunshine Storage Solutions had been happening for 15 years. 15 years of $800 a month. That was nearly $150,000 over the course of our marriage, money I'd never known we were spending. To put that in perspective, $150,000 was more than we'd ever had in our savings account at one time. It was more than we'd paid for Brielle's entire educational expenses from kindergarten through her senior year. It was almost enough to pay off our mortgage completely. How do you hide $150,000 in expenses from your spouse? I felt physically sick as I continued reviewing the statements. Every month, like clockwork, on the 15th, $800 to Sunshine Storage Solutions. Never a missed payment. Never a variation in the amount. Never any explanation in the memo field of the check register that Steve kept with typical precision. My first thought was storage unit rental. Maybe Steve had been renting an enormous storage facility to house his woodworking equipment, or maybe he'd been storing things for his elderly parents before they passed away. But $800 a month would rent a storage unit the size of a garage, and what could we possibly need to store that would justify that expense? My second thought was much darker. $800 a month was enough to support another household, another family, another life that I knew nothing about. I called my sister Nora at 7 in the morning, waking her up because I couldn't spend another minute alone with these thoughts. "Nora, I need you to tell me I'm being paranoid," I said when she answered, my voice shaking. "I need you to talk me down from some very bad thoughts about Steve." "Ava? What's wrong? What happened?" I explained about the payments, about the mysterious company, about the 15 years of financial secrecy. Nora listened without interrupting, which I appreciated because I needed to get it all out before I lost my nerve. "Okay," she said when I finished. "Let's think about this logically. What did Steve tell you about his finances? Did he handle all the bills?" "No, that's just it. We split financial responsibilities. I handled groceries, utilities, and Brielle's expenses. He handled the mortgage, insurance, and his personal accounts. But we reviewed everything together every month. We had a budget meeting on the first Saturday of every month where we went over all our expenses and made sure we were on track for our goals." "And this never came up in those meetings?" "Never. And Nora, we were careful with money. We clipped coupons, we shopped sales. Steve would debate spending $50 on new shoes because he wanted to make sure we were being responsible. How does someone who agonizes over $50 purchases secretly spend $800 a month for 15 years? The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Nora? I'm here. I'm just... Eva, that's a lot of money and a lot of secrecy. Have you tried looking up this Sunshine Storage Solutions company?" I hadn't, but I did it while we were still on the phone. The internet search returned no results. No website, no business listings, no reviews or contact information. It was like the company didn't exist, except that my bank had been sending them money faithfully for a decade and a half. "That's not normal, is it?" I asked Nora, though I already knew the answer. "No, honey, that's not normal at all." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling like I was living in someone else's life. The man I'd thought I'd married, responsible, transparent, methodical Steve, would never have hidden major financial transactions from me. The Steve I knew wouldn't have been capable of maintaining such an elaborate deception for so many years. But the evidence was right there in black and white, printed on official bank statements, with Steve's signature authorizing every payment. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with trying to solve the mystery of Sunshine Storage Solutions. I called our bank, but they could only confirm that the payments had been made. They couldn't provide any additional information about the recipient company. I tried variations of the name in internet searches. I even drove around Columbus, looking for storage facilities that might operate under that name, though I wasn't sure what I'd do if I found one. The more I searched, the more convinced I became that Sunshine Storage Solutions was a fake name. But a fake name for what? What kind of monthly expense would Steve need to hide from me under a made-up company name? The possibilities that ran through my mind got progressively worse. Maybe he'd been supporting another woman and her children. Maybe he'd been paying blackmail to someone who had something damaging on him. Maybe he'd gotten involved in something illegal, and these were protection payments. Maybe he'd developed a gambling addiction, and this was how he'd been funneling money to cover his debts. Each scenario felt both impossible and terrifying. Impossible because none of them matched the Steve I'd lived with for 18 years. Terrifying because if any of them were true, it meant I'd been married to a complete stranger. The worst part was that I couldn't talk to him about it. I couldn't ask for an explanation or give him a chance to reassure me. Death had made my husband simultaneously more mysterious and completely unavailable for questioning. I was left to investigate our marriage like a detective looking into the life of someone I'd never met. Brielle noticed the change in my behavior almost immediately. I'd always been the steady parent, the one who helped with homework without getting frustrated, who listened to teenage drama without judging, who maintained routines even when everything else felt chaotic. But suddenly I was distracted, snappy, and obviously struggling with something I couldn't explain to my 16-year-old daughter. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked one evening when she found me staring at bank statements instead of making dinner. "You've been acting really weird since you started going through Dad's papers." "I'm fine, sweetie. Just trying to make sense of all the financial stuff. It's more complicated than I expected." "Is there not enough money? Are we going to have to move or something?" The panic in her voice broke my heart. Here she was, still processing the loss of her father, trying to finish high school and prepare for college, and now she was worried about our financial security because of my inability to hide my distress. "No, baby, we're financially stable, I promise. It's just, there are some things about your dad's accounts that I don't understand, and I'm trying to figure them out." Brielle sat down across from me at the table, looking more mature than 16 in the way that kids do when family crises force them to grow up quickly. "Mom, whatever it is, we'll handle it together. But you're scaring me with all this stress and secrecy. Dad's gone, and I can't lose you to whatever's in those papers, too." That night, after Brielle went to bed, I found myself standing in front of the basement door for the first time since Steve's death. I'd been avoiding that part of the house because it felt too much like invading his privacy, even though privacy becomes a different concept when someone dies. But now, with $150,000 in unexplained expenses haunting my thoughts, that locked door looked less like a privacy boundary and more like a barrier to the truth I desperately needed. I touched the lock, wondering if the answers to my questions were right there, just a few feet away from where I stood. Maybe Steve had kept records of these payments in his workshop. Maybe there were documents that would explain everything and restore my faith in the man I'd thought I'd married. Or maybe there were things down there that would confirm my worst fears and force me to accept that I'd been living a lie for 18 years. Either way, I was starting to realize that I couldn't move forward with my life until I knew the truth. The not knowing was eating me alive, poisoning my memories of our marriage, and making me question every moment of happiness we'd shared. I just wasn't ready yet to take that final step. Breaking down that door felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross, like admitting that I no longer trusted the man I'd loved enough to marry and build a life with. But every night, as I lay in our bed surrounded by bank statements and unanswered questions, that door called to me a little louder. And I knew it was only a matter of time before my need for answers would overcome my fear of what I might find. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning that started like any other day since Steve's death, with me lying in bed at 5:47 a.m., staring at the ceiling and thinking about money I couldn't account for and a husband I was no longer sure I'd ever really known. For 6 days, I'd been carrying the weight of those bank statements like a physical burden. I'd catch myself touching my chest, as if the shock of discovering $150,000 in secret payments had lodged itself somewhere near my heart and was slowly crushing me from the inside. I couldn't eat normally, couldn't focus on grading papers, couldn't even have a simple conversation with Brielle without my thoughts drifting back to Sunshine Storage Solutions and what it might represent. I'd tried everything I could think of to solve the mystery without violating Steve's privacy. I'd called every storage facility in Columbus and the surrounding suburbs, asking if they'd ever operated under that business name. I'd searched public records for business licenses. I'd even driven past Steve's office building, wondering if his co-workers might know something about his financial activities that I didn't. Nothing. Every avenue I explored led to a dead end, and that locked basement door remained the only potential source of answers. That Tuesday morning, I finally admitted to myself what I'd been avoiding for nearly a week. I was never going to solve this mystery without going into Steve's workshop. Whatever the truth was, he'd kept it behind that lock for 15 years, and no amount of external investigation was going to reveal it. I got out of bed and made coffee with hands that shook slightly, not from caffeine withdrawal, but from the decision I could feel crystallizing in my mind. Brielle was still asleep. She didn't have to be at school for another 2 hours, and lately she'd been sleeping later, which I attributed to depression and the general exhaustion that comes with grief. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and Steve's most recent bank statement, staring at that monthly payment one more time. $800 to Sunshine Storage Solutions, paid on the 15th of every month for the past 15 years, 2 months, and 11 days. The precision of it bothered me almost as much as the secrecy. Steve was methodical, yes, but this level of consistency suggested something more than a casual expense. This was a commitment, a priority, something he'd built his financial life around and never missed despite our sometimes tight budget. I thought about all the times we'd had to postpone vacations or delay major purchases because money was tight. The year we'd eaten rice and beans for 3 weeks so we could afford Brielle's school trip to Washington, D.C. The Christmas when Steve and I had agreed not to exchange gifts so we could give Brielle the bike she'd been wanting. All those moments of financial sacrifice. And he'd been spending $800 a month on something he'd never mentioned to me. The hurt and betrayal I felt was almost physical. Not just because of the money, but because of what the secrecy represented. Steve and I had built our marriage on transparency. We'd promised each other on our wedding day that we'd always be honest, always be partners in every aspect of our lives. I'd kept that promise completely. Apparently, he hadn't. At 7:30, Brielle wandered into the kitchen in her pajamas, looking rumpled and tired. "Morning, Mom," she mumbled, heading straight for the coffee maker. "Morning, sweetheart. How did you sleep?" "Okay, I guess. I had weird dreams about Dad again." She poured herself coffee and added enough cream to turn it nearly white. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you okay? And I mean really okay? Not just the kind of okay you say when you're trying not to worry me. I looked at my 16-year-old daughter, so young to be dealing with this level of family trauma, but also more perceptive than I'd given her credit for. Her eyes were Steve's eyes, the same warm brown that could see right through any attempt at deception. I'm struggling with some things, I admitted. Some financial stuff related to your dad's accounts that I don't understand. Is it serious? I hesitated. How do you explain to your teenage daughter that you're questioning everything you thought you knew about her father? How do you share your fears without destroying her faith in the parent she's already lost? I hope not, I said finally. But I need to do some investigating to figure it out. Can I help? The offer was sweet, but the last thing I wanted was to drag Brielle into my spiral of suspicion and doubt about her father. Whatever I discovered about Steve's secret financial life, she didn't need to be part of that revelation. That's really thoughtful, but this is something I need to handle on my own. I promise I'll tell you if it turns out to be something that affects our family. After Brielle left for school, I found myself standing in front of the basement door again. But this time, instead of just touching the lock and wondering, I was carrying a crowbar I'd borrowed from our neighbor Mason the day before, telling him I needed to access some storage areas for estate purposes. Mason was Steve's brother, older by 3 years and built like a linebacker, where Steve had been tall and lean. He'd offered to help me with any household repairs or maintenance issues that came up, and when I'd asked to borrow tools, he'd immediately volunteered to come over and help with whatever project I had in mind. Thanks, Mason, but this is something I need to do myself, I'd told him. Just some organization and cleaning in areas Steve used to handle. He'd looked puzzled, but handed over the crowbar without argument. Call me if you need anything, Eva. I mean it. Steve would want us to take care of you and Brielle. Now standing, alone in my house with that crowbar in my hands, I felt like I was about to commit a violation that went far beyond breaking a simple lock. I was about to violate 18 years of trust, 18 years of respecting Steve's boundaries, 18 years of believing that some mysteries were meant to stay mysterious. But I was also about to potentially solve a puzzle that was consuming me, destroying my sleep and poisoning my memories of our marriage. The not knowing had become unbearable. I thought about Steve's voice the last time we'd talked about the basement, just a few weeks before his death. We'd been discussing some minor plumbing issues in the upstairs bathroom, and I jokingly suggested that maybe he had spare parts stored in his workshop. Eva, he'd said, and his tone had been more serious than the conversation warranted. I need you to promise me something. If anything ever happens to me, I need you to respect my privacy about the basement. There are things down there that are complicated, personal. I'm not hiding anything bad, but I'm also not ready to share everything with you yet. Steve, you're being dramatic. Nothing's going to happen to you, and if it did, I'd respect whatever boundaries you wanted me to respect. Promise me, he'd insisted. Promise me you won't go down there unless you absolutely have to. I'd promised because it seemed like such an unlikely scenario. Steve was healthy, we were both relatively young, and the idea that I'd be widowed and facing these decisions alone felt impossible. But here I was, crowbar in hand, about to break that promise. I'm sorry, Steve, I whispered to the empty house. I tried to respect your privacy, but I can't live with not knowing anymore. I hope you'd understand. The lock was more substantial than I'd expected, a heavy deadbolt that Steve had installed with the same precision he brought to everything else. It took several minutes of careful work to break it without damaging the doorframe too badly. When the lock finally gave way and the door swung open, I felt a rush of adrenaline mixed with guilt so strong it made me dizzy. The basement stairs were wooden and creaked under my weight as I descended slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I'd expected the basement to be dark, but natural light was filtering in through small windows I'd forgotten existed. The space smelled like lemon oil and cedar, clean, organized scents that were completely at odds with the dusty workshop I'd imagined. When I reached the bottom of the stairs and could see the full basement space, I stopped so abruptly I almost lost my balance. This wasn't a woodworking shop. This wasn't a storage area for personal belongings or old tax documents. This wasn't any of the things Steve had led me to believe it was. The basement was set up like a small warehouse, with metal shelving units lined up in precise rows. Each shelf was labeled with what looked like family names and contained carefully organized items: children's clothing sorted by size, toys organized by age group, household items arranged by type. There was a desk area with multiple filing cabinets, a computer, and stacks of paperwork that looked like they'd been maintained with the same attention to detail Steve brought to everything else in his life. But the most shocking thing wasn't the organization or the scope of the operation I was looking at. The most shocking thing was how clean and well-maintained everything was. This wasn't a dusty storage area that got occasional attention. This was a space that had been actively used and carefully maintained for years. I walked slowly through the organized aisles, reading labels and trying to understand what I was seeing. Johnson family, 2 boys ages 8 and 12. Martinez family, 1 girl age 6, 1 baby. Williams family, 3 children, various ages. Each section contained items that seemed specifically chosen for the families they were labeled for. Winter coats in children's sizes, school supplies, toys that looked new and carefully selected, household items like blankets, kitchen supplies, and cleaning products. It looked like charity work, organized, extensive, carefully planned charity work. But why would Steve hide charity work from me? Why would he create an elaborate secret operation to help families when he could have easily included me in what seemed like a beautiful and meaningful project? I sat down heavily in the chair at Steve's desk, my legs suddenly too weak to support me. The relief I felt at discovering that this wasn't evidence of an affair or gambling addiction was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by confusion and hurt. If Steve had been running a charity operation for 15 years, why had he kept it secret from his wife? Why had he lied about what he was doing down here? And more importantly, who were all these families, and how had Steve been supporting them without me knowing? I turned on the computer, and after a few minutes of searching through files, I began to understand the scope of what my husband had been doing in secret for the past 15 years. And with that understanding came a mixture of awe, heartbreak, and regret that would change everything I thought I knew about love, generosity, and the man I'd been married to for 18 years. The computer screen glowed in the basement light as I scrolled through folder after folder of meticulously organized files. What I was seeing was so far beyond anything I could have imagined that it took several minutes for my brain to process the full scope of what Steve had been doing for 15 years. Every folder was labeled with a family name and contained detailed information that read like social worker case files. The Johnson family. Father laid off from manufacturing job in 2019. Mother working part-time at grocery store. 2 boys ages 8 and 12 who needed winter coats and school supplies. The Martinez family. Single mother, working double shifts as a nurse. 6-year-old daughter and infant son struggling to afford childcare and basic necessities. Each file contained not just basic information, but personal details that showed Steve had been paying attention to these families' lives with incredible care. Birthday dates for every child, clothing sizes updated regularly, school schedules and activity information, even details like favorite colors and interests. The 8-year-old Johnson boy loved dinosaurs. The Martinez daughter wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. But it wasn't just information Steve had been collecting. Each file contained detailed records of deliveries he'd made. Christmas presents left anonymously on doorsteps, back-to-school supplies delivered right before the school year started, winter clothing that appeared exactly when families needed it most. The records went back 15 years and included photographs of grateful families finding packages on their doorsteps, thank you notes left in response to anonymous gifts, and evidence of the systematic long-term support Steve had been providing. In a folder labeled Financial Records, I found the explanation for every one of those $800 monthly payments to Sunshine Storage Solutions. Steve had created a fake business name to hide his charitable giving from our joint tax returns and bank accounts. The $800 each month had been his budget for purchasing items for struggling families in our community. Sometimes it went toward bulk purchases of school supplies, sometimes toward winter clothing for multiple children, sometimes toward specific items like car seats or cribs for families with new babies. The organization system was incredible. Steve had created spreadsheets tracking every family's needs, delivery schedules coordinated around parents' work schedules to ensure packages were received safely, and even a network of what he called delivery partners, people who helped him place packages anonymously without being seen. I recognized some of the names. Trevor, his friend from work who I now realized had been helping with more than just borrowing tools. Mason, his brother, who apparently had been in on this secret operation for years. Even Mrs. Patterson from down the street, who Steve occasionally helped with yard work, had been part of his charitable network. But the most devastating discovery was in a folder labeled Eva, a collection of documents that explained why he'd kept all of this secret from me. The first document was a letter dated just 2 weeks before Steve's death. My dearest Eva, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've discovered what I've been doing down here for the past 15 years. I know you must be hurt and confused about why I kept this from you, and I need you to understand that it had nothing to do with not trusting you or not wanting to share this part of my life with you. The truth is, I was ashamed of how much money I was spending on these families when I knew we had our own financial goals and responsibilities. When I started helping the Johnson family 15 years ago, their father had been laid off and their kids were going to school in shoes with holes in them. I told myself it would be a one-time thing, just enough to get them through a rough patch. But Eva, helping them felt so good, so right, that I couldn't stop. Every family I helped led me to another family who needed support. Every Christmas where I could make sure kids had presents led to wanting to help with back-to-school supplies. Every winter coat I could provide led to wanting to make sure families had warm blankets and heating bill assistance. I knew that if I told you what I was doing, you'd want to help. You'd want to be part of it. And that scared me because I was afraid you'd also want me to be more reasonable about it, more conservative with our spending. I was afraid you'd help me set boundaries that would mean saying no to families who needed help. I was spending money that should have gone to Brielle's college fund, to our retirement savings, to the vacation we kept talking about taking. I was being financially irresponsible in a way that went against everything we'd agreed about money management. But I couldn't stop, Eva. Every time I tried to scale back, I'd get a letter from a family thanking their anonymous angel for saving Christmas. Or I'd hear about a single mother who couldn't afford winter coats for her children, and I'd convince myself that just one more family wouldn't hurt our finances too badly. I created Sunshine Storage Solutions because I couldn't bear to have you see those monthly expenses on our bank statements and ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. I told myself I'd eventually find a way to tell you, to bring you into this work that had become so important to me. But years passed, and the longer I kept it secret, the harder it became to figure out how to explain 15 years of financial deception, even if it was deception for a good cause. I know this doesn't make sense to you. I know it seems crazy that I'd hide charity work from my wife, but Eva, I was addicted to helping these families. It became more important to me than our own financial security, and I was afraid that if you knew how much I was spending and how many families I was supporting, you'd make me choose between being a responsible husband and being the person who could help children have warm coats and Christmas presents. I chose to be both, even if it meant lying to you about how I was managing to be both. Please don't think this means I loved you or Brielle any less. Every dollar I spent on these families was spent with love for you and gratitude for how blessed our life together has been. Helping others was my way of honoring how fortunate we've been, how much love and stability we've had when so many families are struggling just to survive. If you choose to continue this work, there's enough information in these files to contact every family and transition the support in whatever way feels right to you. If you choose to end it, I understand completely. Either way, please know that you and Brielle were always my first priority, even when my actions might have suggested otherwise. I love you more than I ever found the words to tell you. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to share this part of myself with you while I was alive to explain it properly. By the time I finished reading the letter, I was crying so hard I could barely see the computer screen. But I kept reading because the folder contained more documents that helped me understand the full scope of what Steve had been doing. There were thank you letters from families, dozens of them, accumulated over 15 years of anonymous giving. Parents writing about how mysterious Christmas presents had saved their children's faith in magic during impossible financial times. Single mothers expressing gratitude for school supplies that appeared exactly when they couldn't afford them. Fathers writing about winter coats that kept their children warm when heating bills had consumed the family's entire budget. "We don't know who you are," wrote Maria Martinez, "but you gave my daughter the Christmas she deserved when I couldn't afford to give her anything." She talks about her guardian angel who left the bicycle on our doorstep, and I hope you know that your kindness saved more than just Christmas. It saved my faith that good people still exist in the world. "Our anonymous friend," wrote David Johnson, "your support helped us through the hardest year of our lives. Not just the financial help, but knowing that someone cared enough to pay attention to our family's needs and respond with such generosity. You'll never know how much hope you gave us during a time when we had almost given up." Letter after letter, year after year, family after family, expressing gratitude for Steve's systematic, thoughtful, persistent support. He hadn't just been giving money. He'd been paying attention to these families' lives with the same methodical care he brought to everything else, learning their children's interests and needs, timing deliveries to maximize their impact, creating a network of support that extended far beyond financial assistance. There were also photos, pictures that families had left with their thank you notes, showing children with the gifts Steve had provided. Kids wearing winter coats that fit perfectly, families gathered around Christmas trees with presents that had appeared anonymously, children starting school with backpacks and supplies that had been delivered at exactly the right time. But the most overwhelming discovery was in the filing cabinet labeled Current Families. Steve had been supporting 43 families at the time of his death, 43 families who were expecting continued support, who had come to depend on their anonymous angel for help with everything from utility bills to children's medical expenses. I sat in that basement for 3 hours, reading through files and trying to comprehend the magnitude of what my husband had been doing in secret. This wasn't just charity work. This was a full-scale social services operation run by one man who had somehow managed to track and support dozens of struggling families while maintaining his regular job and family life. The financial records showed that Steve had been incredibly strategic about his giving. He'd rotated support among families based on their changing needs, provided intensive help during crisis periods, and gradually reduced support as families stabilized. He'd collaborated with local social services agencies, school counselors, and community organizations to identify families who needed help but might not qualify for traditional assistance programs. He'd even established relationships with local businesses to get bulk discounts on items he purchased regularly, created partnerships with other community members who wanted to contribute to his efforts, and developed a sophisticated system for ensuring that his support actually helped families become more stable rather than simply providing temporary relief. The scope of it was staggering, but what broke my heart was imagining Steve doing all of this alone. Planning Christmas deliveries by himself, shopping for children's clothing without being able to share his excitement about finding the perfect items, celebrating the success stories of families he'd helped without being able to tell his own wife about the amazing work he was doing. He'd created this beautiful, meaningful, transformative charitable operation and then carried the weight of it entirely by himself for 15 years because he was afraid I'd think he was being financially irresponsible. And the worst part was, he might have been right to be afraid. If he'd told me early in our marriage that he wanted to spend $800 a month helping struggling families, I probably would have suggested starting smaller, being more conservative, making sure we were securing our own family's future before committing to supporting others. I would have been practical and responsible and completely missed the point of what he was trying to do. Sitting in that basement, surrounded by evidence of my husband's secret life as a community angel, I realized that Steve had known me well enough to predict that I'd want to put boundaries on his generosity. And rather than risk having those boundaries imposed, he'd chosen to carry the financial and emotional weight of this work alone. He'd been protecting his ability to help these families, even if it meant deceiving me about how he was spending our money and his time. I was heartbroken that he'd felt he couldn't trust me with this part of himself, but I was also overwhelmed with love and admiration for the man I'd apparently never fully understood, and devastated that he'd died before I could tell him how proud I was of the work he'd been doing in secret. I stayed in that basement until Brielle came home from school, poring over 15 years of my husband's secret charitable work, and trying to process what it all meant for everything I thought I knew about our marriage, about Steve, and about myself. When I heard Brielle's key in the front door, I quickly shut down the computer and headed upstairs, my mind spinning with questions about how to move forward with this discovery. Do you continue someone else's charitable work after they die? Do you contact 43 families to explain that their anonymous benefactor is gone? How do you take over an operation this complex when you've never been part of it? "Mom?" Brielle called as she dropped her backpack by the front door. "Why is there a broken lock on the basement door?" I'd been so absorbed in Steve's files that I'd completely forgotten about the evidence of my break-in. There was no way to hide what I'd done, and honestly, I was tired of keeping secrets in our family. "Come sit with me," I said, patting the couch. "I need to tell you about your father." For the next hour, I explained everything I'd discovered: the mysterious payments, the fake company name, the basement full of carefully organized charitable supplies, the 43 families Steve had been supporting. Brielle listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from confusion to amazement to something that looked like pride mixed with sadness. "So Dad was like a secret superhero?" she asked when I finished. "Something like that. And he never told us because he thought we'd make him stop?" "I think he was afraid we'd want him to be more reasonable about how much he was spending. And honestly, Brielle, he might have been right. If he'd told me 15 years ago that he wanted to spend $800 a month helping other families, I probably would have suggested starting with $50 and seeing how it went. Brielle was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands. "Mom, I think we should continue it." "Sweetheart, it's an enormous responsibility. Your dad was supporting 43 families. That's not something we can just casually take over. But we can't just abandon them either, right? I mean, there are kids who are counting on Christmas presents and winter coats and school supplies. We can't just let Dad's work disappear because he's gone." The wisdom in my 16-year-old daughter's response made me realize that maybe Steve had underestimated both of us. Maybe we were more capable of understanding his generosity than he'd given us credit for. That evening, I called Trevor, Steve's friend from work, who I now knew had been helping with deliveries for years. "Eva," he said when he heard my voice, "I've been wondering when you'd call. You found the basement, didn't you?" "You knew about all of this?" "I've been helping Steve with deliveries for about 8 years now. He made me promise never to tell you, but honestly, I always thought he was wrong to keep it secret. What he was doing was beautiful, Eva. I've never seen anything like it." "Trevor, there are 43 families expecting support. I don't even know where to start." "Actually, I do. Steve had been training me to take over the operation if anything ever happened to him. He was more prepared for this possibility than you might think." It turned out that Steve had been quietly preparing for the transition of his charitable work for months before his death. Almost as if he'd sensed that his time was limited. He'd created detailed instructions for continuing the operation, established relationships with people who could help maintain it, and even set aside additional funds to ensure that families wouldn't be abandoned if something happened to him. Trevor introduced me to the network of people who had been secretly supporting Steve's work. Mason, who had been handling some of the heavy lifting and transportation, Mrs. Patterson, who had been helping with deliveries to families with young children, even Julie from the bank, who had been quietly facilitating some of the financial transactions without asking questions. "Your husband was remarkable," Julie told me when I met with her to understand the banking arrangements. "I've been working in financial services for 20 years. And I've never seen anyone manage charitable giving with such precision and care. He tracked every penny, maintained perfect records, and somehow managed to help dozens of families without ever creating a single problem or complication." But the most meaningful conversation I had was with Maria Martinez, the single mother whose thank you letter had been one of the first ones I'd read in Steve's files. I decided that I needed to contact some of the families personally to explain what had happened and discuss how to handle the transition. Maria agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near her apartment, and when I explained who I was, she started crying. "Your husband was our angel," she said. "For 4 years, he made sure my children had everything they needed, not just the basics, but the extras that make childhood magical. When my daughter lost her first tooth, $1 appeared under her pillow, even though I'd forgotten about the tooth fairy because I was working a double shift. When my son needed glasses, the money for frames appeared in an envelope in our mailbox. Your husband paid attention to our lives in a way that made us feel seen and valued and loved. Maria, I had no idea. Steve never told me about any of this." "He was protecting you," she said without hesitation. "He told me once, when we ran into each other at the grocery store, and I tried to thank him, that he kept his charitable work private because he didn't want his family to worry about money or feel pressured to give more than they were comfortable giving. He said his wife and daughter were his first responsibility, and helping other families was something he did with the extra blessings he'd been given." Do you think he was wrong to keep it secret?" Maria considered this carefully. "I think your husband knew that love sometimes requires making difficult choices about what to share and what to protect. He was sharing his love with our families while protecting his love for yours. Maybe that was the only way he could do both. Over the next few weeks, Brielle and I worked with Steve's network to continue the charitable operation, but we made some changes. We brought it out of the shadows, creating a proper nonprofit organization that we named Sunshine Community Support, in honor of Steve's fake company name. We contacted all 43 families to explain the transition and ask if they wanted to continue receiving support through the new organization. Every single family said yes, and many of them wanted to volunteer or donate to help other families in similar situations. Steve's secret charitable work became the foundation for a community-wide support network that was more sustainable and far-reaching than anything he could have accomplished alone. But we also made sure to honor the spirit of Steve's original approach. We maintained the personal attention to each family's specific needs, the careful timing of support to maximize its impact, and the sense of dignity that came from receiving help that was given with love rather than judgment. 3 months after discovering Steve's secret, Brielle and I made our first delivery together, winter coats for the Martinez family's growing children. As we placed the packages on their doorstep and rang the doorbell before quickly walking away, I felt connected to Steve in a way I hadn't since his death. "Mom," Brielle said as we drove home, "I think I understand now why Dad kept the secret." "What do you mean?" "He wasn't hiding it from us because he didn't trust us. He was hiding it because he loved us enough to carry the weight of it by himself. He knew that if we knew about it, we'd want to help. And then we'd be worried about the families, too. We'd feel responsible for all those people, and we'd carry the stress of making sure everyone was taken care of." "Do you think he was right to do that?" "I think he was trying to protect us from having to make the choice between being financially responsible for our own family and being generous to other families. He made that choice for us, so we didn't have to feel guilty about wanting both." That night, I sat in Steve's basement workspace, now our family's charitable headquarters, and wrote him a letter I would never be able to send. "My dear Steve, I found your secret, and I understand now why you kept it. You weren't hiding your charitable work because you didn't trust me. You were hiding it because you loved me enough to carry the financial and emotional weight of supporting 43 families by yourself, rather than asking me to help you choose between our family's security and other families' needs. You knew that if I knew about your work, I'd want to help, but I'd also want to set boundaries to protect our own family's future. You knew that I'd love your generosity, but worry about the cost. So you found a way to be both the generous man you wanted to be and the responsible husband I needed you to be, even if it meant carrying the stress and secrecy alone. I spent 18 years thinking that locked door was hiding something shameful about you. It turns out it was hiding something beautiful about you, something so beautiful you were afraid I might ask you to make it smaller or more reasonable. You were wrong about one thing, though. If you had trusted me with this secret, I wouldn't have made you choose between being generous and being responsible. I would have found a way to help you be both, openly and together. We could have carried this work as a family instead of you carrying it alone. But I understand why you weren't sure about that. I understand why 15 years of small, practical decisions about money and budgeting might have convinced you that I valued security more than generosity. I don't blame you for that mistake, because it means you were paying attention to who I was and making decisions based on what you thought would protect both your charitable work and our marriage. I wish you were here so I could tell you that I'm proud of the man you were in that basement. I'm proud of the families you helped, the children who had warmer winters because of you, the parents who felt less alone because of your anonymous support. I'm proud that you found a way to live your values, even when it meant keeping secrets from the person you loved most. But mostly, I wish you were here so I could tell you that you taught me something about love that I didn't know before. Love doesn't always look like sharing everything. Sometimes love looks like carrying extra weight so the person you love doesn't have to. Sometimes love looks like making difficult choices in private so your family doesn't have to live with the stress of those choices. You loved our family and 43 other families for 15 years, and you found a way to do it without asking any of us to sacrifice for the others. That wasn't deception, Steve. That was love in its most complicated and beautiful form. Brielle and I are continuing your work, but we're doing it openly, as a family. We're turning your secret into something the whole community can be part of. But we're making sure to preserve the heart of what you created, the personal attention, the dignity, the love that made your help feel like a gift rather than charity. Every time I unlock that basement door now, I'm not opening a room full of secrets. I'm opening a room full of love that you spent 15 years building for families who needed it. And every time I make a delivery or help a family in need, I feel close to you in a way I never did when I thought I knew everything about who you were. Thank you for teaching me that the deepest love sometimes operates in silence, and that the most profound generosity sometimes requires the heaviest secrets. Thank you for being brave enough to help 43 families, even when it meant disappointing me about our savings account. Thank you for choosing love over fear, even when love was more complicated than I ever understood. I love you more now than I did when you were alive, because now I know the full scope of your heart, and I promise to continue the work you started, not just the charitable work, but the work of loving generously and completely, even when it's complicated, even when it requires difficult choices, even when it means carrying more than seems reasonable for one person to carry. You weren't hiding from me, Steve. You were protecting me so you could protect everyone else too. Now I understand the difference, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to love as bravely as you did. 6 months later, Sunshine Community Support had grown into an organization supporting over 100 families, with dozens of community volunteers and sustainable funding sources. But every month on the 15th, the day Steve used to make his anonymous payments, Brielle and I make one delivery together, just the two of us, in honor of the man who taught us that love sometimes wears the disguise of mystery, and that the most beautiful secrets are the ones that reveal how much someone cared about the world around them. I never did get to tell Steve I was sorry for doubting him in those final moments before I broke down his door. But I hope he knows that I understand now, and that I'm grateful every day for the gift of discovering that the man I married was even better than I knew.